Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Lookout. Today's September 8th. It's my brother's birthday. Happy birthday, Nils. Today we're going to talk about the Mosquito Fire. Got some new information from overnight. We're going to look at the Fairview and Radford Fire in Southern California. We're going to check out the Fork Fire and talk about the weather and just kind of take a little bit of a map tour of these fires. Glad you all joined us yesterday. Got some questions here in the sidebar, and I'm going to cover those when we get to the end. We're going to jump right into maps here and give you an update on what we know. If you're just joining me this morning, my name is Zeke Lunder. I'm a wildfire analyst and mapping specialist. Been doing this work since the late 90s. And I don't go out on fires anymore, but I do cover this stuff now from Chico. And we're all user supported. This is not official fire information. So I'm not speaking I'm not assigned to the incident, not paid by them. I'm using public information and interpreting it. All right, so we're going to look here at the Mosquito Fire to start. This is where the fire was at about 3 a.m., this outer perimeter. We've got kind of stacked up layers here of the previous mapping to kind of give you an idea. So as of 3 a.m., the fire had not crossed the Rubicon River. This purple in the foreground is the Ralston fire scar, which is from 2007. And so the fire has burned out of that scar here above the Rubicon. But yeah, as of 3 a.m., we were worried about the fire with down canyon winds getting across the river and running up towards Volcanoville. That hadn't happened as of 3 a.m. So the fire's kind of marching steadily to the east and a little bit to the north. It's really in this kind of unique place on the landscape where we're at this junction of all these major rivers, these major canyons. We talk a lot in fire and fire behavior about alignment. It's kind of when the wind lines up with the terrain and the fuels, and the fire can then kind of run, say, up canyon or up a slope. The problem with where we're at right now is that if the wind comes from the northwest, it can be in alignment with the Rubicon drainage. If it comes from the west, it's aligned with the Middle Fork American. If it comes from the southwest, it's aligned with the North Fork of the Middle Fork of the American River. So it's just it's a real complicated place on the landscape to for us to do anything about this fire down in these canyons. It's just going to be really tricky in this steep ground for us to work on the up canyon side of the fire. So kind of the best prospects early on a fire like this are on the ridges and on the heel of the fire. So as of last night at 3, the fire was kind of growing up out of this canyon here. This is an old fire scar from 2008 that isn't going to probably do much for us. But as of about 3 a.m., there's a large spot in this and is burning up into here. So pretty likely that by now the fire has crossed into here, but we don't have good intel, and I don't know what's going on the ground there with firefighting. If there's any dozer line that's been pushed on this ridge, how steep it is. So that's, hopefully sometime this morning we'll get an updated perimeter, and we'll be able to see what became of this spot that was burning here at 3 a.m. Fire hadn't spread much up on this ridge. You can see like the fire made a run yesterday overnight, night before last, made its first big run. And then it got out in here in the afternoon. And this was about 4 p.m. And then this is the like 3 a.m. So there wasn't a lot of spread here between 4 p.m. yesterday and 3 a.m., which is a good deal because these ridges and flanks are where we pick up the fire. Of course, there's a possibility that if this fire here spreads over this ridge, then it can kind of make a backdoor run up into here and kind of negate all the work that got done here with, there was a ton of air tanker drops here early on in the fire and yesterday. So hopefully it can be held here but we don't really know where it's at right now. So we'll have updates. We'll update on Twitter. Depending on what the fire does, we'll have another update tonight too. So that's what we know right now. It's just that the fires marched pretty steadily up through here. It pretty much burned all through Michigan Bluff. There were firefighters in there trying to do what they could, but fire really had a lot of momentum. And the column, we were watching the giant smoke column building yesterday on the cameras. That went through here. So, and there's only so much firefighters can do under conditions like that. Green dots are structures here. We just wanted to bring that up to kind of show in the big picture that there's not a lot of structures out to the east of this fire, but as you move west, you get into Foresthill, and down here lower, a lot of structures. So, obviously, huge priority is to get what we can get done on the west flank as a really massive priority. And there's not a lot we're going to be able to do to stop it in these canyons until we have better topography, like on these ridges, or we get a weather change or rain. So that's Mosquito. We'll come back to this when we do our questions, but now we're going to jump down to the Fork Fire, which also made some good movement here in the last 12 hours. So we're flying south here. We're looking at all the fire history in California, which is, it's a map that is always changing. So yesterday Fork had made this run here. Not sure what time that mapping was. This mapping is from, the most current mapping is from about 2:30 this morning. You can see the fires made a big run to the southeast. This mapping here was from yesterday evening. So the fire, this happens a lot, especially when we've got some sort of frontal passage happening or minor kind of disturbance passing through. We'll get our prevailing winds. So this is, just go north up here. Our prevailing winds in a lot of California are from the southwest, and you'll get a strong push on initial run of a fire with the prevailing winds. And then if you get kind of a minor frontal passage, then you get northwest winds, and what was your flank before becomes your head, which is really dangerous for firefighters because we don't like to fight fire at the head if we can help it, unless the conditions are really moderate. So that's what happened yesterday. Fire opened up a front, a bunch of flank, got a wind change. Winds came out of the northwest overnight, and the fire's made a big run here. It's see if I can measure this here. Mile and a half. All right, so that's Fork. Don't have any on the ground intel on this one. As we talked about yesterday, we've got the Creek Fire up here, and so that kind of limits the potential of this fire to really. Obviously, there's a lot of people and assets between this and the Creek Fire, but in the big picture, the Creek Fire is like a mile away from this, and there's control lines from that fire and reduced fuels. And so someone had a question about air tankers and competition for air tankers, and all of this stuff plays into that. What's the potential for this fire to really become huge? Compared, when you've got 4 major fires, we start looking at how many structures are within 5 miles. What's the fire history? What's the, are there lakes and other features that are going to contain this? Obviously, no one wants to burn up this land, but on days when you got 4 or 5 fires burning, if another fire starts in Placerville or somewhere where there's 20,000 structures within 2 miles, they're going to get the big air tankers. It's just kind of cold, hard math. Okay. Coming out, and if you're affected by these fires or you're working on them and you have intel for us, get a hold of me. Yesterday we had a great assessment of this Fairview Fire here from someone who knows it as well as anyone in the world. I'm going to turn off. So we got the fire history here, and I'm going to turn that off just because it's a little confusing. Okay, so we talked about Fairview last night, and about how it's really got some potential to become large because of the roadless nature of this kind of wildland that it's burning into. Fairview started out in here with an east wind, burned down this kind of dead end road, took out some homes in this neighborhood. Here's Cactus Valley Road here. Here's Hemet. We've got ag fields out in here that the fire's kind of burned out to and stopped. We've got Batista Canyon. And the fire jumped Batista Canyon the day before yesterday in the afternoon. And by last night, it was pretty well established out in here. And then overnight, it's made a big push out to the north and east towards Highway 74. As we mentioned yesterday, like there's decent likelihood that this fire could burn all the way out 74 out to Anza. This whole kind of dark area of kind of heavy, unroaded or poorly accessed old growth brush. And in the fire history, you can see there's not a lot of fire history out in here. So as our friend down here told us, like this is some of the kind of biggest chunk of unburned chaparral in Southern California. So likely to keep growing large. Not a lot of spread on some of these flanks, but like this whole area here burned in the last like 12 hours. And so there's Sage Road out here. So we'll keep an eye on this, and we'll check back in with our contact down there and get their perspective on what's coming on. Okay, over to Radford Fire, burning at Big Bear Lake. Not a lot of spread on this fire in the last 24 hours. A little bit of spread from last night until like this was mapped 10 p.m. So there was kind of minor spread yesterday downslope. There's a couple little spots here. They're irrigating this whole the upper slopes of the ski areas with their snowmaking equipment, and that just these denuded areas of the ski area kind of create a fuel break. So kind of the open question with a lot of these fires is just we've got this hurricane remnant coming in, the K, and it's tracking closer to the farther to the east than they predicted before. And they're also predicting really strong Santa Ana type winds. And weather forecasters are saying this is going to be a really weird Santa Ana event. So having fire on the land anywhere down here in front of a big east wind is problematic, obviously. And so they expect, next couple days, today's Thursday, for that to happen. I'm not really a weather person. I'm not much of a meteorologist, so I can't tell you much about how the storm's going to track, but there's a lot of people who are talking about it, and I think Daniel Swain's going to be doing a blog post on the upcoming weather and on the fires on Weather West blog, so highly recommend checking out Dr. Swain. And we'll reach out to him again today and see if we can get another summary from him. So that's Radford burning here near Big Bear. All these green lines, if you didn't see yesterday, are the power grid. And neither the Radford nor the Fairview are really threatening major transmission lines. It's California, what a place. Let's jump out here to outer space and figure out where we are. So, we're going to jump in here to Yosemite real quick. I covered Red and Rogers last night, and I made a mistake. I saw that we'd gotten a FIRUS flight. FIRUS is OES's Intel plane. And so I assumed that we had new perimeters here when I covered it last night. And it turns out that the FIRUS, they didn't fly perimeters. They just flew live video. So I need to jump in and turn on the satellite heat stuff. We talk about the satellite heat detection stuff. It's a good big picture tool. It's problematic when people start using it to say like, oh, the fire across the road, or here's a spot fire. because that's not really what it's intended for. But turns out that the perimeter I showed you last night for red is it's like over a week old, and the fire has spread out into here. It's kind of doubled in size or more. And so I'm hoping we'll get a more detailed perimeter of that. Red is still contained by granite. And, you know, when they make a decision to let a fire burn in this backcountry, that's what they're looking at. They're looking at, like, what's the maximum extent it's going to get out to. And so the granite and previous fire scars here, the Meadow Fire from 2004, the Empire Fire from 2017. This Illilouette Basin out here, it's kind of like a poster child for the Park Service for repeat applications of prescribed natural fire. So that's the red, and then Rogers is kind of up closer to Tuolumne Meadows Road. Red is south of Half Dome. You know, here's Half Dome down here, and Rogers is up here. And Rogers is kind of spread a little bit out in. There's just kind of vegetation outgrowing scattered in the brush here, or in the rock. So some growth on Rogers too. So we'll probably get new perimeters for those. There's a Forest Service incident management team. There's also a fire called the Aspen Fire burning out here, and I don't know where it is. I don't know if it's if that's the growth we're seeing here near red or not, but I'm hoping we can get a little better intel on where Aspen is at. We're going to jump out to the far northeast corner of the state. Barnes Fire. This fire is burning by Fandango Pass, which is on the north end of the Warner Mountains. Fort Bidwell, so we're looking east here. Here's the Oregon state line and Highway 395. Barnes Fire started yesterday afternoon with a strong kind of west wind and made a run straight up to the top of kind of Fandango Pass. I think it's Fandango Pass here. And it's kind of spotted out ahead of itself. There's a National Type 1 Incident Management Team assigned to this fire. They haven't, I don't think they've gotten there yet. But that just, when you see a Type 1 team assigned in the first like 6 hours of a fire, it tells you that they know this fire is going to burn for a long time in tough country, and they expect it to be a big deal. Fort Bidwell here is it's a pretty small town. Surprise Valley in general, you know, there's a couple little towns out there. And there's one other fire showing up on Modus, which is over here by K Falls, the Van Meter Fire. This fire is kind of surrounded by ag lands. And then when we're talking about fire potential and who decides where air tankers go, you know, in the big picture, this fire is already contained 90% by irrigated fields, and it just happens to be that you know, that it's not a small area, but when you look at, you know, resources threatened, $36,000 acres. But when you look at the resources that are threatened here, not a lot of people, a lot of brush, some timber. But if you're in a competition for, you know, 4 large air tankers on the West Coast, you might not get them here because, you know, you don't need the air tankers to save the town. Town's surrounded by ag. So that's tough, but it's all politics too, you know. So the air tankers are coordinated out of the National Fire Center in Boise. And they're just looking at the big picture and deciding who's going to get what, playing God, and someone has to do it. I don't envy them. All right, so I'm going to jump out here out of the map and look at some questions. Catherine's World says, can you show a compass on the map? Yeah, there's a compass in the top corner. It's a little hard to see, especially if you're on a phone or something. But up in up here in this corner of the map, there's a compass. And no, I can't make it bigger. Sorry. The chief treasurer gave me $9.11. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. What's the chance a mosquito fire makes a run to 50? let's look at that on the map. Any thoughts on the fire going towards Volcanoville in this week? Rum Creek has less smoke. What else? It's raining in Moreno Valley, midway between Fairview and Radford fires. Should Georgetown be concerned? And chance of the Mosquito Fire getting to Colfax. All right. Those are all good questions and valid concerns. So let's turn on the fire history here. And we'll talk about it. All right, so here's Mosquito, and let's just give it kind of like quick overview. Here's Highway 50, Pollock Pines. Here's Highway 80, Blue Canyon, Immigrant Gap, Colfax, Foresthill, Georgetown. I've just got the structures turned on in this area here, just because it was choking my map to have a point for every building. So what's the potential? We look at previous fires and what they've done and how they've spread. Here's the King Fire, and it started here in Pollock Pines, and it did spread quite a bit to the south and the east and west. The King Fire here also creates a kind of good buffer now. If you come here and look at the private timberland in the King Fire, they salvage logged a lot of it. So they came in and they cut down all the dead trees, and they removed a lot of the brush, and they planted new trees, and they sprayed herbicide to kill the brush. So that creates this kind of regional scale fuel break, which reduces the likelihood of this fire burning through the scar over here to, above Pollock Pines. I think it's too early to tell really what the fuel potential. When you look at fire history, there hasn't been a big fire out in here for a long time. And so you've got a lot of fuel. You got contiguous fuel. And I think what the Dixie Fire, Butte Fire, like a lot of these big fires we've been having show us is that under extreme conditions with the weather, the fires kind of are going to do what they want. I expect that the main push of the fire is going to be out to the east and north following the canyons. But we really can't rule out that the fire is going to burn out here. There's good likelihood that we'll be successful in holding the fire on Foresthill Road. And I can't really get too far out on the limb of what the fire is going to do. All I can say is that there's contiguous fuel between the fire and a lot of places without fire history. And it's all about the weather. And so we just really have to watch the weather and see, if a big east wind is forecast, that's bad news. And the fire is going to continue to kind of drive itself up the slope here. But the fuel's potential is high all around this fire for it to kind of go wherever the wind wants to take it. One thing I will say is that it's not real common for these fires to like burn up out of one watershed and into another, right? So we had the King Fire ran the Middle Fork drainage, right? But it didn't, it's hard for these fires, unless there's something crazy going on, for them to burn actively down a north slope in a canyon here. So like when the King Fire started to kind of burn, it made a big run up the Middle Fork, and then it backed here for days. And so we don't see a lot of fires in the Sierra that like take out multiple major river watersheds. Caldor, it made this big run, but it held up here on the north slope in the American River. So that's one thing these fire histories can kind of tell us, is just that you don't see a lot of times where a fire is going to like burn up out of one drainage down the next. So, in general, we don't see these fires just marching like from drainage to drainage towards the north. They like to run with the canyons east to west. But But what we do see in this year is just that we're filling in these gaps where we haven't had fires with large fires. So we had the King Fire, and we've got the Caldor Fire, and we've got, the Rim Fire, and we've got the Creek Fire. And slowly but steadily, we're filling in these unburned areas of the Sierra with huge fires. And so the scary thing is when you have a fire in somewhere like this, here's the Butte Fire. So you have fire start somewhere around Arnold or Murphy's or something and has potential to burn this whole big chunk that hasn't burned yet. We just see it at the big scale. We see that we're filling in these gaps. So, its potential is high that Mosquito is going to fill in this gap. And then the next scary thing is, Yuba County here that hasn't had a big fire. Up in Butte County, we've had the Bear Fire that filled in a big gap. We've had the Dixie Fire that filled in a big gap and tied into the Beckworth Fire and the Walker Fire. And we've got the Camp Fire here. And so, slowly and steadily, these gaps are filling in. When you look at a place like the Klamath River up in the northwest corner of the state, like their puzzle pieces have all kind of filled in now over the past 2 decades. Their entire landscape has had fire, and not all of it's severe. And now when they have a fire up here, it's kind of self-limiting. You have a fire here, it can't burn 1 million acres like the Dixie did because it's surrounded by areas that have burned. So we're just kind of watching that unfold on the west slope of the Sierra, and this fire is just going to fill in another piece of the puzzle that hasn't had fire. Someone says Truckee isn't too smoky today. People are someone in Truckee says that Mosquito's giving them Caldor vibes. I made an offhand comment yesterday about the fire getting over the top of the mountains. Things like Caldor, they show us the potential, and there's definitely a non-zero chance of this fire marching up to the crest of the Sierra. It's too early for us to really make that call, and the weather is everything. But we've got, it's similar to the Caldor in that you've got a lot of unburned ground between you and Tahoe with canyons that point that way. Someone says we get diurnal canyon winds, so winds move both directions daily. Someone noticed on flight radar a NOAA plane flying over Mosquito. We've seen the NOAA plane flying over on flight radar over a bunch of these fires, and I think that potentially they're monitoring the smoke and trying to model the emissions. I haven't seen any mapping from them, so maybe we can. If anyone knows what's going on with NOAA and what they're flying, let us know. Last thing I want to say here was what? There's some good fire behavior models that are kind of experimental that look at how these things unfold, and we'll talk about those in a future show. But they look at where the fuel is and the weather, and they kind of make predictions day by day of what the fire is going to do. Speaking of diurnal winds, what that means is just that the way that these mountains work basically is in the summer in the afternoon, the mountains get hot in the afternoon and the heat rises off the mountains, and that creates kind of a low pressure, and that pulls the winds up from the valley. And so every afternoon you have winds that rush up these canyons because the mountains are getting hot and the air rising there needs to be replaced. That's kind of the layman's description. And then at night, that air over the high country cools faster than the air down in the low country, and it sinks and it pushes down these canyons. So it's kind of like clockwork. That every day in the afternoon the winds are going to blow up canyon, and every night they're going to blow down canyon. So that buys some advantage for us if we're firefighting. If we're going to light a firing operation, if we decide, hey, we're going to put a dozer line in here and fire off of it, knowing that you're going to have downslope winds, then you'd say, okay, we're going to schedule this firing operation for 3 a.m. because we have reliable down canyon winds. It's a little tougher in the, if we're going to try to fire off a ridge down and here, same thing. You have up canyon winds, except that they're coming at the peak dryness and kind of flammability of the day, And so you put fire on the ground with up canyon winds, and it's dicey putting fire on the ground during the peak of the day. And then whatever you put on the ground, you're going to have to hold when you get the night down canyon winds. Someone else wants to know about if the fire is going to get down to Georgetown. It's going to find Georgetown here on the map. Here's Georgetown. I don't know. I don't know if it will, but what we just were talking about is just that there's a lot of fuel between you and the fire. There's also this 2016 fire that reduced a lot of the fuels in that area, and that is going to buy advantages if the fire gets to it. There's also control lines from that fire that are still, dozer line that got put in that was rehabbed. So that's a good thing as far as, recent fires on the landscape are what help us contain large fires. So it's not a bad thing now to have this 2016 trailhead fire scar between you and the fire. But this fire, the problem is that this fire is going to burn out into here. And then if we do get east winds, do we just have the farther the fire gets up the canyon, the more exposed Georgetown and other areas are to east wind effect. I think there's other people out there who know more about kind of the history of east wind driven fires. The east winds don't affect, the east winds drove the Bear Fire up here. This fire burned, hit a huge downsloper on the 8th of September 2 years ago. So exactly 2 years ago, Bear Fire jumped the Middle Fork Feather and ran down to Lake Oroville. So, but that is a different kind of, in the big picture, that fire was exposed to landscape scale weather coming from the desert, right? And so the crest of the Sierra, as it gets higher and farther south, there's not all of the Sierra are exposed to the same level of kind of continental scale weather that the northern Sierra are. So like when we had the fires that burned down the Bear Fire and everything else, there was this huge wind event. So here's Canada, and here's Washington and Eastern Oregon, and here's Alturas and Susanville. And so we're looking kind of up over the whole, like the whole Great Basin here, right? Like, and I know this might be a little hard to see on your smartphone or whatever else, but Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, the east side of the Cascades, the desert, Nevada, Great Basin. The crest of the Cascades comes down through kind of western Oregon. It comes down into Mount Shasta and Bernie and Westwood, and the Sierra meets it there. And so we've got this crest of the continental divide, basically, of the West Coast, and then the Great Basin. And so these big east wind events that came down and caused the Bear Fire, they kind of run over the desert, and they came down and they could kind of get down into the Feather River and kind of through around Honey Lake. As you get farther south, it's harder for that to happen. The crest of the Sierra is higher, and you're just you're not quite as exposed to this kind of continental influence, in my experience, right? So we can't necessarily look at the Bear Fire and say like, oh, it shows that east wind fire is going to blow this fire 30 miles to the west. We can't rule that out, but there's less history of that happening as you move farther south in the Sierra. So I could use some help on that hypothesis from anyone who really studies this stuff. But it's one of those things that is kind of a critical question in fire research right now is, where do you have potential for the big east wind driven fires to spread on this landscape? And how does that risk change as you move up and down the Sierra? Because the east wind is really when we have our big destructive fires, our Camp Fire, our Bear Fire, our Slater Fire. And so we're moving into that season. We're moving into the kind of fall wind season, and that's definitely a concern with this fire. King Fire started in September also. It didn't make big runs to the west. Okay. Someone asked a question about competition for air tankers, and sorry, I kind of missed that. They asked, when we have competition for these large air tankers, is that a function of economics? And I guess the question is, like, should we build more air tankers? If we had a dozen VLATs, would it make a difference? I think one thing that's important with all this is that you've got a couple days a year where you've got all these consecutive fires, or all these simultaneous fires, and we can't really build a fire suppression machine with staffing and engines and water trucks and air tankers that deals with the 99th percentile, meaning that we put out 97% of the fires when they're small, and it's not like we can spend 1% more money and put out 98%, or 2% more money and put out 99% of the fires. It means, the difference between putting out 97% of the fires and putting out 99% of the fires is like, doubling the budget. And so from that budgetary perspective, it's kind of impossible to staff up to a level where you can contain 100% of the fires. It's just the days that, like we had yesterday, it wouldn't matter if you had 30 DC-10 air tankers dropping on this fire. You wouldn't stop the run it made to the east. So when we talk about competition for air tankers, they've kind of figured out, like, hey, here's our budget. We can afford this many tankers, and you're going to have to compete for them. And we're going to come up with metrics for who gets them and when and why. So there are people sitting there making those calls, watching the intel, looking at the demographics, looking at the structure density, and but it's the whole thing with fires. Like, we can't really spend our way out of it. The better we get at initial attack, the worse the fuels get. We spent a lot of money on very large air tankers in the last 5 years. Even, like, 10 years ago, we didn't have very large air tankers, but even with all those tankers, we're still seeing Dixie fires, we're still seeing Slater fires, we're still seeing Bear fires. And so it kind of begs that question of, are we trying to solve the right problem? Is getting better at initial attack making our forests less likely that we're going to lose them all in catastrophic fires? And I think the answer is no. Putting out every fire, there's no other political viable solution. No one's going to let fires burn in Camptonville or Brownsville or Dobbins because so many people live there. But we all know that putting out every single fire is what gave us these sick, overgrown forests that are now prone and are burning in mega fires. And so when people say, like, hey, I got this new idea for a drone that's going to put out more fires or more webcams, etc., it's like, well, that's a short-term solution. But we can't just keep putting out every fire and expect that we're not going to burn up these places that are surrounded by areas that haven't burned for 100 years. When these areas haven't burned for 150 years, they're not going to be any better off. They're not going to be any safer than they were 100 years ago. Catherine's World, best use of California's budget surplus. Prevention, thinning, home hardening, prescribed fire. Someone says computer models show the fires come on the Volcanoville side of American River. As of 3 a.m., the best intel we had was that it had not. These dots aren't computer models; they're satellite heat detections, and the square kind of shows you the pixel size that it was derived from. So that's kind of your margin of error. When you see these heat maps, you see a dot out here, it could be anywhere in that square. So far as we know, as of 3 a.m., fire has not crossed the river. Catherine's World, during the third year, not La Nina, it's not the best time to let them go wild. No one's making a conscious decision to let this fire go wild. They're doing everything they can to put it out, but the fire is not listening. Someone asked about using old fire lines to fight new fires. Is there any effort to maintain and add new fire lines through the state? Yeah, there's a lot of fuels thinning going on. A lot of the private timber companies are cutting fuel breaks. So if you look like up around where I live in Butte County, private timber companies here are thinning along ridge tops to a pretty wide spacing, thinking that if there's a fire, this is going to be a spot that it helps firefighters. You can put a fire line through this thinning area and potentially hold a fire. And the only problem with the whole fuel break concept is that when your fire is spotting a mile or two, the fuel break, it doesn't buy you anything. But control-wise, the one thing that's good about fuel breaks is that, like here, there's a fuel break along Highway 32. It helps firefighters and public have safe access and egress getting out of places during fires. So roadside thinning and roadside fuel breaks, really important, really useful, helpful. But in general, we're seeing that a lot of these fires, like the Dixie, like there were a lot of fuel breaks cut inside the Dixie fire in the last 30 years, and it's still got to be 1 million acres. So when fires are spotting and driven by that long range spotting, they don't help that much. Okay. I think that's about it, folks. Got to get the kids to school. We appreciate your support. As I mentioned in the comments here, we're supported by donations. If you check out our webpage, thelookout.org, the-lookout.org, you can donate there. You can become a subscriber, and the subscriptions help me buy camera lenses and make videos and go talk to people and put fuel in my truck.